Let's break into one of the most aggressive and widely played openings in chess, the Sicilian Defense, and see how you can turn the tables and punish it. If you play pawn to a4 as white but do not want to deal with the super complicated main lines of the Sicilian Defense, I recommend going for the so-called Alapin Variation. It is much simpler, yet still quite tricky and aggressive. Your main idea is to play pawn to d4 and establish a strong pawn center. Another advantage of this variation is that, in most cases, your opponent will play knight to c6, which is a standard developing move in the Sicilian Defense. However, against the Alapin variation, this move is actually inaccurate. You continue with pawn to d4 as planned, strengthening your center and directly attacking the pawn on c5. You are also ready to push your pawn forward to drive away the black knight. Usually, black will exchange pawns, but even then, they still have to worry about your threat of pushing the pawn forward and kicking away their knight. This shows why developing the knight to c6 so early was not ideal in the first place. At this point, black must find a response. In most cases, they will try pawn to d5. If they do not, then you simply advance your pawn, force the knight to retreat, gain space, and achieve a very comfortable position. If black does play pawn to d5, then the game takes a sharper turn. Here you should respond with knight to c3, surprising your opponent. They were expecting you to capture the pawn, but instead you increase the pressure, leaving them with a decision to make. Now, the pawn on d5 is attacked twice. In the majority of cases, black will go for the most straightforward option, capturing your pawn on e4. I will explain later what to do if they defend the pawn, but usually they will capture immediately, expecting you to recapture. Instead, you surprise them again by pushing your pawn to d5. Anyway, now this pawn is free to advance, and you can gain both a space advantage and a slight development advantage by driving away the black knight. The next question is, where can the knight go? It cannot move into the center of the board because your queen controls that square. Retreating the knight all the way back to its starting square is possible, but it feels far too passive for black. Therefore, the move that most of your opponents will choose is knight to e5. At this point, they expect you to finally recapture the pawn. However, you play in a trickier way. You first deliver queen to a forecheck. Once they block the check, you then recapture the pawn with your queen, while also attacking the knight again and gaining yet another tempo for your development. Now, what options does black have? The knight must move. Trying to defend the knight with pawn to f6 is very awkward, because the other black knight becomes locked in and cannot develop, plus the king's safety is seriously compromised. It is simply a very poor position for black. Therefore, black will likely need to move the knight away. Here you could simply develop and enjoy your space advantage, but there is also a neat trick, knight to b5. Very often, opponents will respond with knight to f6 to hit your queen or pawn to a 6 to chase the knight, but both moves can lose instantly to the brilliant checkmate with knight to d6. Even if they see the threat, stopping it is difficult. If they try to trade the knight, their king is checked, the queen must block, and you simply capture it. Another tempting try is queen to a 5 check, but you can easily defend. Your knight on b5 is protected, so the queen must retreat, wasting time. In the end, black must guard both the d6 square to avoid checkmate and the c7 square to prevent a fork against the king and rook. Therefore, black will usually respond with queen to b6. At this point, you just keep attacking the queen, trying to push it away from these critical squares. After a couple of checks, the queen will eventually have to move, and once it does, the position collapses in the same fashion. For example, in this game Grandmaster Shannon played this variation as white. His opponent chose pawn to a 6 instead of capturing. By doing so, black tried to protect the central pawn on d5. White then pushed his central pawn forward, gaining space and reaching a position similar to the French defense advance variation. However, it is actually an improved version for white, because unlike the French, there is no pawn on c3 blocking development. This allows white to bring the knight to a comfortable square, giving a great position. In the main line, the most common idea for black is to develop the kingside pieces normally. They bring the bishop out, then the knight, castle the king, and play exactly as classical chess principles suggest. But then they lose instantly to the famous sacrifice. Bishop takes he7 check, the so-called Greek gift sacrifice. The black king is forced to move, and then knight to g5 delivers a check. If the king retreats to g8, white continues with queen to h5 followed by queen to h7, a standard attacking pattern that delivers checkmate. If instead the king moves forward, it must avoid the diagonal controlled by your bishop. Even then, it remains extremely vulnerable. You can push the pawn forward or play queen to d3 check, and either way, the game ends quickly. For instance, after pawn to h5 and the king stepping aside, white played knight to f7 with a double check, which also attacked the queen. When the king moved, the knight captured the black queen on d8, and black resigned soon after. Now what if black tries something different, such as developing the knight to c6? Well, if black plays passively with moves like pawn to d6 or pawn to g6, it really does not matter. You can simply play pawn to d4, build up a strong pawn chain in the center, develop your pieces comfortably, and you do not need to know anything special. The position is already excellent for white. You just reach a slightly better position with a space advantage. In this example, we have a game between two grandmasters. Black played knight to f6, a move you rarely see at the amateur level. It attacks the pawn on a 4, but the drawback is obvious. White can simply push the pawn forward and attack the knight. Still, the knight remains in the center, which makes the move playable for black. The position is sharp and tricky. White then continued with pawn to d4, and after the exchange in the center, black played pawn to d6, opening the black squared bishop's diagonal and trying to undermine white's center. White responded with bishop to c4, gaining a tempo by attacking the knight. This led to a spectacular game. Black played knight to b6, counterattacking the bishop. White answered with bishop to b5 check. Up to this point, the moves looked fairly standard, nothing unusual, but then everything changed. After bishop to d7, instead of trading bishops or retreating, white suddenly played pawn to a 6. At first glance, this looks completely counterintuitive. Why would white give up the pawn like that? Here's why. The bishop on d7 cannot capture the pawn, because it is pinned to the king. And if black tries to grab the bishop on b5, white has the stunning move queen to h5. This queen move creates a very unusual double attack. The pawn on f7 is pinned to the king and attacked, while at the same time the queen also targets the bishop on b5. Black can continue, but the position becomes extremely unpleasant and dangerous to defend. That is why, in the actual game, black decided to capture the pawn on e6. White then calmly retreated the bishop to d3, creating yet another direct threat. For example, if black were careless and played a generic move such as knight to c6, white could immediately finish the game. The winning sequence is queen to h5 check, and after black blocks the check, white sacrifices a piece, most spectacularly the queen, and it leads directly to checkmate. Of course, black noticed this danger and instead played pawn to g6 to control the critical square. White nevertheless pushed pawn to h4, aiming for pawn to h5. The position was still very difficult for black to defend. Black played knight to c6, and white advanced with pawn to h5, attacking the pawn on g6. Clearly, black could not capture it, because queen takes h5 would be checkmate. To defend, black played rook to g8. After the exchange on g6, white unleashed a brilliant move. Rook to h8, sacrificing the rook. If black accepts, then bishop takes g6 is checkmate. Realizing this, black instead tried king to f7. White continued with a queen check, forcing the king to move again. Then came yet another stunning move. Rook to h7, the second brilliant rook sacrifice in a row. This time, black had no choice but to capture the rook. But then white played queen to h5, sealing the game. The pawn on g6 was pinned to the king, and the h6 square was covered twice by white's bishop on c1. Black could not defend. If the king moved, white would simply play queen takes g6, followed by queen to h7 checkmate. Even with logical moves, black fell to white's brilliant sacrifices. And that's how white turned logical moves into a brilliant victory. Thanks for watching.